super glad to see you all. I'm hoping we have a good conversation today. We will have opportunities to have some smaller breakout conversations, but most of it's going to be together. And I'm going to use a slideshow to organize this. Um, we have put in some questions, time for questions at the end. Let me first ask my co-host. I need to make her the co-host. Make co-host to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I am Carly Epstein, and I'm a second grade teacher at Essex Elementary School. And John and I have been working together this year, providing intervention for kids in the area of math. So I'm excited to be here with all of you today and to get to do this with John. So thanks, John.
Okay, I'm going to get started in just a second. I'm not going to say too much. Most of you probably know who I am. I'm John Tapper, and I was the person who got all learners going 4 years ago. I was a college professor at St. Michael's College and at the University of Hartford, but this year I decided to go back to the classroom. So I am now a K-2 math interventionist at Essex Elementary School. And I'm kind of loving the experience. I have to say, little guys are hilarious. I have always known that, but it's great to remind myself of it. And I've been writing about working with kids that have various kinds of difficulties for 10 years or so now. And it's great to be back on a daily basis. I've always worked with kids, but on a daily basis and be able to share some of the stuff I've been doing. And this workshop is really about the stuff I do day to day. What I want to be clear about is that we are going to talk about some games, and Carly is sitting at school with tons of badly organized materials for games. But we really want to spend a good chunk of this workshop talking about the notion of games as intervention. So it's not just a make and take deal here. I really want to get into the weeds a bit about why it's so important to do this. Um, okay, so before I start this deck, since I can see almost all of you, holy smoke, how many of you are there? Does it tell me?
56 right now, John. And just as an aside, I can keep track of the chat too, if you're
That
sharing
would
your
be
screen.
great. That would be great. Um, hmm. So with this many people, it's a little bit hard. I would love to have started with games the use of games in your practice already, but I'm going to start in with the screen share, and we'll take opportunities um, to talk as we go. All right. So my goals, right? We're going to talk about math intervention writ large from an ALN perspective. And I want to be clear, like, Bob was, there are different ideas about what math intervention is. And ALN has very, very specific and clear notions about what it means to do math intervention. And I never apologize for those because, we're not imposing them on anybody. They're one of the really interesting things about the ALN view of math intervention is that it's based on some empirical research. I certainly spend a lot of time reading empirical research, but it's more based on what our coaches and teachers find in the field and how we translate into practice for everybody. So there's nothing that we'll share with you or tell you about in terms of intervention that we haven't tried a lot. And that's one of the reasons why I think ALN has been so appealing for teachers is that we really rely on experience. So we're going to talk about the rationale and practice of games. Most of you are just going to nod your heads around the rationale and practice, but I know for a fact that there are many of you sitting out here who would like to be able to do this, but you're worried that an administrator or a supervisor or someone else would look at what you're doing and say, well, is that really math intervention? So part of the reason for providing you with the rationale here is to give you some cover for doing something that's actually good for kids. And administrators often really like to have that. And then finally, we're going to share a whole bunch of games organized by category. So I'm going to just give an introduction, and Carla's going to tell you about this. But Essex has a really interesting approach to the way they look at intervention, and I thought it would be useful to share that with you as we start. So go ahead, Carly.
So this year in particular, and I'm sure different schools are at different places, but this year in particular, we have really got on board with just essential standard work. Last year, we spent a lot of time deciding on our essential standards. This year, we've really rolled them out in our Tier 1 instruction. And specifically for math, we've been really focused on what that first instruction looks like, how we're going to formatively assess, just all of that good practice around just the cycle of inquiry with kids. And then specifically at the Tier 2 level, the work that John and I have been doing along with the rest of the second grade team is really looking at those specific learning targets within the essential standards. What do kids have? What do they not have? And then what does the intervention look like to support that? That's kind of the big idea behind how Essex is working through that Tier 2 instruction. So John pushes into my room a few days a week. He and I are working with students, doing some shared work with kids on what exactly do they need in terms of the learning targets that address those essential standards that we're currently teaching, and how that works to keep kids on pace and give them exactly what they need as individual math learners within the context of each essential standard.
So if you can imagine that a school takes the high leverage concepts, I'm hoping that you are familiar with that idea of high leverage concepts, the thing a kid needs to know by the end of the year, and they broke them into bite-sized chunks throughout the year. During Tier 2 instruction, we're focused on one of those chunks. And by the way, if it hasn't been published soon, it will be published that there are K-5 versions, not of the Essex Essential Standards, but some work that ALN people did where they take each of the high leverage standards and break it into smaller standards, right? So the instruction is very focused on one particular classroom goal. The Tier 3 end of things is for when kids are pulled out for gap filling, right? So I want to be really clear that Tier 2 is about addressing, supporting kids to be successful with grade level math that they're doing right then. And Tier 3 is about meeting them during other times for gap filling. And in Essex, they've committed to a kid does not have to be on an IEP to get Tier 3 support. There are things they have to do in order to do that. But this is an important context for what we're talking about, because most of the intervention that I do is supporting kids to learn the things that the other kids in their class are learning. So
John, there was one question in the chat, if I can just stop you for a quick second, about when this intervention happens, which is an important thing to talk about. So in Essex, we have, as part of our master schedule, there's been a commitment to an intervention time. So for both ELA and math, we have two separate blocks. We have just the regular math block, and then we also have it's called Pride block at our school, but it's essentially an intervention block where no new instruction is happening, but there's focus, and we're going to talk lots more about that as we move through this. But we've been doing a lot of work with Math Menu, with John's support on how to support kids during that intervention time to really target those essential standards and learning targets that they need that are happening currently in the classroom.
Yeah, so everybody give that a thought. They've in their schedule, what I'm going to interpret this from an ALN perspective, they've got a main lesson, a launch main lesson part of the math day, and they've got a menu part of the math day, which is fabulous for interventionists because we can push in during the menu part without interrupting what the kids are doing. For tier 3, we do pullouts at other time, but for tier 2, which is the bulk of my math intervention time, it's done during this pride block, which is essentially a math menu time.
Yep. So, and then there was another question, how long are each of these blocks? So the main math block is 50 minutes and the intervention block's 45.
And 45, I mean, I could always use more time, but 45 is something I can work with. So I get a 45-minute block every day with all 3 grade levels, and then additional time here and there is needed. So I get this question about intervention programs a lot, not just from people who are writing to me through ALN, but uh, from administrators as well. In fact, when I go to fill out the Title I paperwork on my students, there's a little place that says, which intervention program are you using? And so I mention this because it has a lot to do with the way ALN looks at intervention. Um, One size doesn't fit all, and that's why you're doing intervention, right? So for those of you that watch football, does anybody watch football? Just, yeah, not many of you. Okay. Well, anyway, imagine, I mean, I'm assuming you know something about the game, but imagine that a team is just losing over and over again, and the solution to their losing is that someone says, do these plays. Like, it would be a laughable suggestion in the world of football, even at the high school level, to say, well, if you do these plays, you're gonna win. Um, and it's the same thing with students. The idea that there's a program out there that if you follow it, students will magically understand is crazy. From my perspective, it's crazy. But it's also a rationale for the stuff we're going to be talking about for games here. Okay. I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm not suggesting games as like an add-on or a helpful thing. The primary thing I do in math intervention is games. And there's reasons for this, right? So first of all, they're really flexible. I can change a game in some small way in the moment to meet a student need. There's this whole thing that comes up, and those of you who are special educators or interventionists are going to know what I'm talking about, that has to do with student engagement. That one of the terms I use is forward facing. So you can see this easily in a student that's on the autistic spectrum, right? Give me a thumbs up. I can see some of you if you work with kids who are on the spectrum at some point. Okay. All right. So you know this experience of, you know, what you'll hear teachers say is they're so inconsistent. But you can also observe when the student's attention is forward and they're engaged with you, and when they've retreated. Yeah, I mean, for kids on the spectrum, that retreat is really notable. There's a sense in which you're dealing with 2 kids. And so the notion that you can teach very much when they're retreated, and you know this because they give you sometimes crazy answers, and you're thinking, wait, just a minute ago, you seemed to understand what we were doing, and now all of a sudden. So the same is true with the students, any students that you deal with. If you want to really see this in action, go to a high school math classroom and watch how long it takes for the students in that class to get the 1,000-yard stare. Online, it's amazing because people, of course, I mean, you can tell they were like, oh, if I could just click my camera off, then I could hear it going in the background. And that's sort of the approach that students are taking, right? When they're like, uh-huh, yeah, mm-hmm. The teacher says, oh, yeah, does everyone get that? And they're like, uh-huh, yeah, mm-hmm. Right? So for intervention, we have this short window of time, and we need to get students there. We have to have them forward facing and engaged with us. And games are fabulous for this. Actually, with the students who I do tier 3 with, I can watch those moments when we're doing sort of problem solving and I see the wheels go off the track and I see the retreat and I know they're going to give me something that it doesn't really represent their understanding. So these days I find myself always trying to figure out how can I switch into a game situation where they're going to have more investment, where they're going to be more engaged. And by the way, I mentioned this to Carla when we were planning this. There is a bunch of research on gaming and education. It's done by someone named Jimmy G. He's written about gamification in a variety of different ways. It's worth a good look if you're into that sort of thing. One great thing about games is that they allow you to probe without pressure, right? Because there's not a right or a wrong. There's a good move or a bad move. There's a good decision or a bad decision. But you're not going to be wrong either on an assessment or in front of your peers. So the anxiety is lower. And one of the things that happens with anxiety is working memory resources shrink. So you're getting more of the student forward facing and engaged with what you're doing. And then the last thing about playing the games is, I think for the first month in Essex, I was known as that guy who plays games with you. And that is a great tag to have. It means that people are not going to be reluctant. Oh, I have to go with so-and-so for, I get kids running up to me. Can I come play games with you today? I sometimes have to make a little time in my schedule because there's certain classes that I don't see a lot of kids in, and I have to make time to go in those classes and work with them. Okay, so here are some suggestions about playing games with students for intervention purposes, right? So you all have games in your curricula. A couple of things about that. Sometimes those games are very elaborate, and that can be fine, but in general for intervention, simple is usually better. Also, this is a comment for classroom teachers, for everybody. Games are not the dessert, right? So I'm sure some of you remember everyday math. Any of you teach everyday math? See a couple heads nodding. Okay, so there were everyday math. There was a lot of games involved in everyday math. And people would give them to kids when they've done the other work in the lesson. But in the design of the curriculum, the games were actually the practice. So if kids were not doing the games, they were not actually getting the practice they needed in order to understand the math. So not doing the games or treating them as you can do it when you're done, that was really problematic because it deprived the kids of essential practice. Okay, so simple is good. Have a goal, right? So we like to play games, but the difference between playing games as a menu activity and playing games for intervention is when I sit down with a kid to play a game, I know what they're trying to learn. And I am looking for opportunities to see that aha moment. Okay, and just briefly, I've talked about this a lot. So I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version. Learning math is not a linear process. It would be lovely if it were. I could tell you the things that you needed to know and you would know them in order. That would be awesome. But the reality is learning math is more like explosions of insight. You have to get stuck. You have to care about a concept, get stuck, and then you have a moment where you understand. If there's a skillful adult there at the moment when you understand, or there's an activity where you get to reflect on or express your ideas about that concept, it's going to connect to other ideas in your brain and it's going to be useful to you. The idea here is we are trying to create insight, and then once it happens, we're trying to make the student aware of it and build on it. So, as a small example, we're going to talk about some games where kids are learning 10 pairs, because that's a big deal in first grade. And so frequently, I will line up the 10 pairs: 10, 0, 9, 1, 8, 2, 7, 3, 6, 4, and ask the kids if they notice any patterns. And, for the kids that I'm seeing for intervention, frequently they'll say, I don't know. But sometimes they'll say the numbers are getting smaller on this side and they're getting bigger on this side. And then once in a while, you'll see this moment where somebody says, wait, it's like you're taking one off of this side and adding it onto the other side. You're just kind of moving them. Okay, that's what you mean by a moment of insight, because that idea of moving, of compensating, is going to create access to those 10 pairs that almost nothing else will.
And John,
So, yeah.
I think it's a good point to bring up too, going back to what Bob had shared about the purity of formative instruction and formative assessment, being there and being able to see it immediately, and that interaction between the teacher and student in real time. And he really emphasized the power of that a lot in that opening address that he gave. And I
Yeah, and
think too, that's the place where you put some great questions in there, but really just those open-ended questions. How do you know? Just why do you think that? Say more about that.
Say more about
You can
that.
get, there's simple questions that I think can take that aha moment and move it so much further that you wouldn't otherwise get to see if it wasn't that one-on-one interaction like that.
Right, right. And that's sort of the difference between intervention and classroom instruction, right? Because in classroom instruction, you're doing the kinds of activities that are going to bring the vast majority of students to understanding. But with intervention, you're going to have a chance to do that one-to-one, back and forth. So with my college students, we talk about probing questions. Probing questions are a question you ask that gets the student to go a little deeper. How did you know? I mean, so I ask, how did you know, so many times during the day, it's almost like a record. A student will build a number out of place value blocks: 284. They'll build it in front of me, and I will say, how do you know that's 284? I take nothing for granted, and I have always found this to be a very successful strategy in working with kids that are having difficulty. So look for the opportunity to ask the question, and then look for the insight. Did they make the leap? Sometimes it takes a lot of tries at that before they finally do. The last thing I want to emphasize is that you have a good time doing this. Because if games are a drag, what's the point? So it's easy to get so serious and focused that we lose the fun. But the fun is what's going to keep the kids coming back to the games over and over again and looking for new things in them.
And John, just one other thing that I know you and I had talked about, and I can't remember if it's coming up, but you had talked a lot when we were planning this about that relaxed curiosity, and that idea that if you suck all the fun out of it by, okay, now we're going to sit and we're going to record every equation from this game that we did, or then we're going to talk about, you can drag it down and then they aren't as relaxed. Then it feels more like an intervention. It feels like an assessment. It feels like, and then you'll see them draw back, and then you'll start to hear the answers that there's no connection happening. So that idea that kids are just relaxed and engaged because they're curious is a great benefit to this as well.
The best state for your brain to be in, for you to have an insight, if we were to measure your brain waves, which is something that's been done, you would be in a state of relaxed curiosity, and that's the state that games can put you in. And I'll give an example of what Carly's talking about, right? So I'm playing Go Fish, some version of it. We're going to talk about a bunch of versions. I'm playing some version of Go Fish, and a kid says, do you have a 4? And I give him a 4 and he puts a 6 and a 4 down. Now I could have him record that, and there's value in that. But if they have to do that all the time rather than just playing the game, it slows things down. And especially for kids that have difficulty writing their numbers, which is another thing that can be practiced, it can make the game unplayable. I mean, that's my experience. Like, they lose interest. So instead, we change the language. So instead of saying, do you have a 4? The student says, do you have a 4 to go with my 6? Which is a kind of verbal equation that does the same general kind of thing without slowing the game down. So we're going to go back to checking out those games. And I want to say at the outset, there is nothing particularly earth-shattering about these games. I don't think you're gonna say, oh my God, I've never thought about doing that. What I'm hoping is, as we talk about their implementation, and again, we'll have a little time, hopefully at the end, for questions and for you to talk to each other. I'm hoping you get some ideas about how to use these specifically for the K-2 population. Also, I want to say I only asked in a couple of rooms. I couldn't get to all the rooms. But it sounded like there's pretty good support for using games for intervention. And that made me very happy, because I can absolutely say that has not always been the case. Okay, let's do the thing. Where is it? All right, the games. So I categorized them. And I want to make the point at the beginning that you should change the games any way you can to meet the needs of the learner. So we're going to talk about these. They're sort of templates for games. And I have some comments specifically about the early learning games. But this is the way I've categorized them, and this is where we're going to start. Okay. Now, when I'm explaining these to other adults, or even sometimes I still teach some methods classes at St. Mike's, even to those students, they seem like dumb games. I'm going to be right up front about that. And yet, they're very useful. Okay, so one of the first games I play with kids is in kindergarten, and I would do this in pre-K, are gems in a 5-frame. So many of you already know this, but if you don't, those colored aquarium stones that you can buy at pet stores, are you familiar? Yeah, okay, a lot of you know about this. Good. So why children love them, I don't really know, but they really do love them. So,
John, are you talking about these ones?
oh wait, let me look back. Let me see. Yeah, those. That's it. Gems. They're nicer than, I like them because they sit flat because they're made to be in an aquarium. They have ideas about the best colors and they want to make patterns. Anyway, so all this game consists of is rolling a die, and then if the student is able to subitize the die number, they put a gem into the 5-frame. Okay, so some really important questions that I ask them as we're doing this. How did you know that was a 4? I want them to tune into the rectangle shape so they're starting to build some understanding about the relationship between shapes and how the numbers build. So for example, I love to say, what do you notice is different between the 4 and the 5? And they'll tell you, oh, there's one in the middle. So why would 5 be 1 in the middle and 4 not be 1 in the middle? Because 5 is more than 4. How much more than 4? It's that 1 in the middle more than 4. What's the shape of a 6? So we talk about that as we're learning to recognize, to subitize 1 through 6. Now, I want to make a point because it was a really good conversation in one of the rooms about explicit instruction. I'm not apt to say, see, this is a 3 because the numbers are in a diagonal and they go 1, 2, 3. I'm much more asked to say, this is 3 because we've just counted 3. What do you notice about this? How is it different from 2? 2 and 3 have that same relationship that 4 and 5 had. So I'm much more likely to ask the student to make the leap, to make that small intuitive leap, than to tell them what to look for. And it's not because I think that telling them what to look for isn't reasonable. It's just, in my experience, when you tell them what to do, it doesn't have the same impact in their own learning as when you let them do the discovery. So then as they put gems into the 5 frame, I ask them more questions. And it's all very casual. I'm sure you can imagine how this exchange goes. Once we've, everyone's got their own 5 frame and their own gems and their own dice, and we've put hand sanitizer on everybody, and I've got my shield and my mask, and good Lord. Then I will ask the question, so how many gems do you have in the frame now? And how many more do you need to make 5? And so all they're doing is rolling the die and putting gems in the frame, but it's a great opportunity for us to have conversation about subitizing these amounts and adding gems to the frame.
John, if I can just add too, I think you bring up a good thing back to when we were talking about probing questions, those comparison questions, and the importance of how is this like this, or how is it different than this? Like when you're talking about 4s and 5s and 3s and 2s, giving that back to the kids as a way to compare what they know about one thing to help them understand another.
Right. We're building on what they already know.
Yep.
Yeah. I will also say that I had a kid come in this semester and he had not had a lot of kid experience, honestly. And so we spent one entire intervention block rolling the dice, taking turns, because he had no idea about taking turns. He just wanted to roll and roll and roll. So we would, again, I always wonder what my colleagues think when they see me doing this with kids, but we would roll the die and then we would yell, hooray! And then for some reason he decided that when the 1 came up, that was good. But we moved from rolling the die and saying hooray to being able to do the gems in a 5 frame. Okay. A Tower as Tall as My Head is one of those games that kids, like many of these, that kids sort of suggested in the moment. So I had a bunch of kindergartners. So kindergarten, pre-K people, you were with me here. And all they could count was 3 or 4. That's as many as they could count. Okay, so I needed them actually to practice counting 3 or 4. And I wanted to bump them up to being able to count to 5. So I pull out a handful of 3 or 4 cubes and put it on the table in front of them. They have to count them with 1 to 1. And then if they count the group I've given them, they add them to a stack. And so the stack gets bigger and bigger, which is so exciting. And they try, I mean, again, if I'm explaining this to undergrads, they're looking at me like, really, Tapper? But if you've worked with 5-year-olds, you know what I'm talking about. Like, it's up to my chin. It's up to my nose. Right? So we count over and over and over again until the stack is as high as their head. And so it's just they're repeating counting 3, 4, and then as they're comfortable, I slide the 5th cube in. And I might give them help with that, but then we can start to count 5. And actually, this little game has been really helpful for getting them to move up their counting. We do a horizontal version of that because, as you know, some of them go a little crazy with the stacking. Also, the little hands don't always seat the unifix cubes easily. So we do a laydown version. I have a piece of cardstock that has a number line on it, and they do virtually the same thing where they add a certain number. They roll the dice, they add that number to the stack every time. That can be played in pairs, though. So 2 kids on either side of the number line. So a kid rolls 2, they add 2 to their part on the number line. Kid adds 3, they put 3 on their side. And that allows me to ask questions like, who has more? How many more do you think you need? What would be a good roll? All of those kinds of questions. Again, really, really like that game. I put Monster in the Tunnel here. It's not a game I play. I've only played this game with 1 kid, but I put it in here for a very special reason. So, let me back up for a second. When I was working, I did a lot of work with Fletcher Elementary School, and they have this wonderful pre-K teacher there, Nancy, and we were doing some assessments on her kids, and she made the comment about a student. She said, she spends a lot of time in housekeeping. I need to find a way to get more math into housekeeping. And it struck me as a really great little vignette of the difference between early childhood perspective and elementary perspective in some ways, right? Because we want to get the kid to come out of housekeeping and join us to do the things we want to do, whereas the early childhood person is always thinking about the kid. And so I had this same student who had trouble with rolling the dice. It was really hard to get him to count things. He is very restless. He watches a ridiculous amount of inappropriate television. And he loves things that are scary. So I found this block. It's like a tunnel. And I put it on the table between us, and I crawled my finger through, and as it went through, I went like that all of a sudden. And he jumped back, and he laughed, and then he looked at my hand and counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so I did my hand a few times, and then he did his hand a few times, and he really looked forward to coming out for 2 or 3 days and playing this game with me, where we would talk as we were going through the tunnel. I'd make my hand like a spider, and we'd have all this conversation. But it engaged him in the moment in the counting. We graduated to this game called Shark Attack. Do any of you know Shark Attack? Okay, just for the record, it's a terrifying game. There is an enormous spring-loaded shark jaw. Very realistic. Not the happy, friendly, and there was Jaws shark. This is like shark. And there's 10 little fish on rings that you pull out. Okay? And at some point, the shark jaws close. But not only do they close, the shark leaps up and closes his jaws around you. So I brought this thing out, and this little boy's eyes were the size of saucers. He was, at the same time he was horrified, he was so into it. And when he pulled, I don't know, we'd count 1, and you'd have to use the quavery voice. 1, 2. When he finally pulled the 4th or 5th one, and the shark jumped up at his hand, he said, "Jesus Christ!" It was awesome. Awesome. We played that game. We still play that game on and off because it has 10 in it. And this kid who came in with 0 numbers counts objects with one-to-one correspondence up to 10. Similarly, number walks, which I thought was a clever version of number talks. Number walks, number talks. It's a gift. So this little girl's teacher told, well, she has a really hard time sitting. And so we do this thing where when we start our intervention, where I have a stack of 10 numeral cards and we walk down the hall, and as we take steps, I hand her cards and she says the number. Hand her cards and she says the number. And then we get to the end of the hall, we turn around, she hands them back to me and says the number. We do this thing with forwards and backwards. She has me skipping down the hall with her. It's not a pretty sight. Again, I wonder what my colleagues think when they see me skipping down the hall trading cards. But she's super into it, and she loves to come to math intervention so that we can do, she'll say, can we do a number walk? Can we start with a number walk? We also play red light, green light. She'll bring a partner out, and I'll say, you can take 6 baby steps, or you can take 6 sideways steps, or 7 giant steps. She loves that. Okay, to finish this early number list, Hungry Critter. So these are made commercially, but all you do is draw some animal. You know, I don't know if it's in the stuff you have, Carly, but there's a caterpillar in one of the red bags. I don't know if you can find it. Anyway, essentially the belly of the animal is some design made with pattern blocks. Now those are the bugs. For the same kid that likes Shark Attack, he loves these gross, they're really disgusting bugs. They have soft bodies and everything, but he'll count them, and we play various things with that. So the Hungry Critter is you put something inside a critter. You know, like you can take 6 of the equilateral triangles and make a circle out of them, or you can make something out of a bunch of other pieces. And they roll and they add pieces to the middle. They like doing that. And then the Number Detective is a game that, no, that's okay. The Number Detective is a game that, again, a kid kind of invented. So she's an older kid, and she's in 1st grade, and she doesn't recognize numerals. And so one of the things we do is I give her 1 to 10 cards, and she goes to put them in order. But she finds that boring, and it's hard for her. So instead, what we do, is you have to imagine this. We lay out the 10 cards so they're all showing, and then we turn around or close your eyes and flip one of them upside down. So if she's the detective, I turn a card over. So now she can see 9 cards facing up, and there's 1 facing down. And she's got to figure out which card is hidden, which turns out to be fabulous practice for the counting sequence and for knowing what the numerals look like. And that was just a game she likes to do. I never know what she's going to do when she comes. She'll say, I've got a new game. And this was one. And I thought, oh my God, this is great. I've been doing this with other kids now. Okay.
John, the one thing I just want to connect back to some of the goals that we had for today with all of these early number games as interventions. They all are really kid specific, and they're very simple, and they respond to the need of the kid. Like the shark game isn't going to work for every kid, even though it's very goal oriented, it's very targeted. But for some kids, that's just going to scare them and they don't want to play. Then they're going to be afraid of Mr. Tapper who comes to get them. And it's going to be awful. Yeah. But in knowing the kid and responding to the kid and intervening with the kid to get them to that place of relaxed curiosity, like you got that kid's attention in a way that you may not have otherwise been able to do that if you just said, okay, today we're going to work on counting to 10. And he may still not know how to count to 10, but because you gave him a sense of, oh, this is actually really fun, and I'm relaxed about it now, and I'm actually really curious about when this shark is going to snap its jaws, all of a sudden he's engaged in math, and those probing questions are what get more of the math to be more intuitive and to get him more engaged in the math in a way that's really important to him.
Yeah, we had good conversations about how far you get before the shark bites you. What number did we get up to? I'll also say I've had some fails in all of this. I had a game where I bought these, they're freaking adorable, these little stuffies, little critters. They were, you know, I'm sure they're made unfortunately, in a sweatshop in China, but they're just tiny little critters. And I had this game where the critters were on a 10 frame. And again, perhaps those of you who have been doing this longer are just saying, oh, I already know where this is going. But anyway, they were super engaged, but all they wanted to do was play with the little stuffies. And, you know, I'm up for little conversations between stuffies as much as the next guy, but you don't get a lot of math done there. So the stuffies have gone away. Same, I had these little toy cars, and you wind them up a little and they'll shoot across. So I thought, oh, they'll be really interested. And they were really interested in counting them out of the box. But beyond that, I couldn't. They're used at the end of sessions. Yeah, those cars. They're used at the end of sessions sometimes when kids want to do some playing when they've been working really hard. Okay. So capture games are bank, and I'm sure many of you have played these before. So Domino Capture, I'm a big believer in dominoes. I inherited this set of foam dominoes, which is interesting because the kids like to touch them, and in the time of the pestilence is problematic because they're hard to clean. So my colleagues in the intervention room don't always love me because in order to get this stuff clean, I leave it all spread out all over the tables before I go home so that when they fog the room, they fog my materials. Okay, so the idea with capture is just who has the most. You can decide who has the least if you want, but who has the most wins. And so I modify the sets so that we work on the numbers that we're working on. So I'll take only numbers 5 and less to work with lots of K kids. I also set it up so that they win every time. So there's a rumor going around at Essex Elementary School that Mr. Tapper is terrible at games, which I'm happy to live with. So I'll put a pile of dominoes in front of them, and they count the dominoes to be sure we both have the same amount. And then we turn the dominoes over, and I say who has more. And again, it's so much opportunity for doing all kinds of things. So for starters, we want to subitize those rectangular arrangements like we did on the dice. So one of the things I ask them over and over again is I'll cover up half of the domino and say, can you tell me how many without counting? So, and by this point in the year, most of the kindergartners and first graders can subitize through 6. Okay, so then we use the subitizing to learn how to count on. And this is a place where I will demonstrate. They don't invent counting on their own. So if they have a 4 and a 3, I'll cover up the 3 and say, what do you know that is? And when they say 4, then we'll count together 5, 6, 7. And this is actually how many of them learn to count on. We do stuff with 10 frames that occasionally helps that. But so Domino Capture, I can get a kid anytime randomly to play that game with me. When they get older, you can use Domino Capture to learn sums to 12 quite easily. We have conversations about doubles. It's great. We were working on sums to 10 as an essential standard in first grade until a couple of weeks ago, and it's something that we used all the time. we do all kinds of card capture games. So, and I want to emphasize that one of the things that makes a kid a struggler is that they don't always make connections from one thing to the next. So, when we're playing 10 frame capture, so all the kids have are 10 frames and they compare the two cards and decide who has more. I will always ask them how many are in that 10 frame and how do you know? Let's see. Carly. Well, actually, no, you know what? I know you all have 10 frame cards. You're K-2 people. Of course you have 10 frame cards. So the first is capture.
These are ones John made, though, if you want to see them.
Yeah. I bought a lot of blank cards.
John, just so you know, there is a question, and you don't need to address it right now, but Cheryl was interested in a collection of probing questions. If that's something that exists, if that's something that there's a resource available for us to come back to maybe at the end.
I think there's a blog post at All Learners about it. And if any of you have Solving for Why, there's absolutely a list of questions at the back of the book there. I will see what I can do about getting that posted at ALN. But in general, how do you know? Why did you do that? Tell me how this works. Those are probably the ones. How do you know? I mean, I have college students who complain that they just want me to tell them the answers to the freaking problems instead of saying, how do you know? Come on, Tapper. Okay, I'm noticing that it's also 11:15. So anyway, my only point about the card capture and all these different kinds of cards are that they need help making the connection between going from 10 frame cards to numeral cards. They don't make it immediately. And so you may want to do other games like the matchup games to be sure they're matching numbers and 10 frames at the same time. Because ultimately when you see 6, you want them to have a mental picture of one side of a 10 frame filled and the 6 on the other side. And so these card capture games are ways to do that. And then double capture is just when they put 2 cards or 2 dominoes out together and add. Okay, fishing games are my favorite games. And I've had to do numerous modifications to play them. So, you know, it's been a while since I've never been well, actually that's not true. It's been a while since I've taught K and 1. And so I learned really quickly that, for example, 6-year-olds don't really know how to hold cards. It's a whole thing for them, yeah. So anyway, when we start playing fish for sums to 10 or sums to 12 or even sums to 14 with the right deck of cards, I just lay the deck of cards out on the table with a small group of kids and they take turns pulling pairs out. Okay, now, in the age of COVID, once they pulled the pairs out, you're done. Like technically, you're not... they can't put the cards back in again once they've touched them, even if they've cleaned their hands and you've washed the cards and everything. There is good evidence that you can't really get COVID from a surface at this point, but in our district, that's the way it works. So I have multiple decks of cards that I play this with. I come with at least 3 or 4 decks in every little box I bring to intervention. Okay, so I would call that spreading the decks out. That's open fishing. And they love to do that. It's really good to do. They love to help each other out. A group of boys that I was doing this with invented a version, again, which they love, where I set a 10-second timer on my phone. And they have to pull a pair out of the middle within 10 seconds. And as you can imagine, there's lots of jumping up and down, and they help each other out. And it's very motivating. I would be the first person to tell you that timed anything is not a great idea. But for this particular group, I wouldn't do it individually either, because that's way more pressure. But when the kids can help each other out, it just adds this layer of fun to the whole thing that everybody really enjoys. Okay, and then open hand fish is just like playing Go Fish, but you leave the cards up because often when they're holding their cards, they don't know whether they have the right ones or not. So, in order to get them used to it, you both have your cards up. I would also, though, insist on the language. If I'm playing fish for 12, I say, do you have a 5 to go with my 7? Do you have a 6 to go with my 6? That language is really important. And when I've done follow-up assessments of students' understanding of addition and subtraction facts after playing these games, it's like magic. They just roll right through them. Really, really helpful. And then Make 20 is a game that Carly helped me with. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure. So Make 20 is, if you've ever played the game 31, it originally comes from the game 31. It's a card game. Each player gets 3 cards. And then the object of the game is to get, as in Make 20, to get as close as you can to 20. So there's a lot of decomposing numbers, composing numbers, and it's really flexible and dynamic because each turn you draw a new card. And then, so now you're making sums with 3 cards, which is a little bit more complex, but certainly one that kids really enjoy and get a lot out of. And then a great place for those questions. How do you know? How do you know that? And then when you think you're the closest to 20, just like a lot of other card games, you can knock, everybody gets one more turn, and then you can do a lot of comparing. You show your hands, or you can play face up to make 20.
Yeah, I've noticed, so a couple things I've noticed. One is that when they start playing this game, they'll always make 20 with 110, and they'll make 10 with their other 2 cards. And so it's this really interesting moment when some kid decides they're going to play an 8 and an 8 and a 4 instead of a 10 and an 8 and a 2. And, then there's all like, wait, you don't have a 10. Oh, but it's still 20. So it's a very cool game. They really like playing it. Okay.
John, someone had asked about dice cards. Dice cards are literally just a deck of cards, but on the, you have them, I'm looking, but dice cards are just, oh, here's one. They just have, if everybody can see my screen, they just have the dice pattern in the middle.
Yeah, I'll say, what's annoying about all the number cards are the upside down numbers that everybody insists on putting on them.
And even sometimes the font, I find like the font on the 4s and the 9s can get some kids, especially the 9s.
Okay, in order to have some time for conversation and questions, I'm going to go very quickly. The matching games you've all done, versions of memory. We match numerals to 10 frames. That's probably the place I use it the most. And Carly would point out that having all the cards facing up as a first try with memory is fine. Can you just find the cards on the grid that go together to doing them all facing down?
Well, I think too, John, and we had talked about this too, because I think for some kids, it takes a long time to not just find the match, the double, the pair. So really making sure, going back to that sentence frame that, John and I have been playing with sentence frames a lot with a few particular students, but just, so if I have a 6 to go with my 4, those types of conversations are really important in helping kids, even in the fishing games, because you'll find they'll often ask for a card that matches what they're looking at, not what they're actually looking for when they're first learning that game. So helping just to scaffold that a little bit by having them all face up. And then the other thing, John, I wanted to add to that about using numerals and 10 frames when we think about just sequencing from concrete to representational to abstract, it really helps to make some of those connections. So kids have those mental pictures of this is how 10 can look in my head when I'm not seeing it. So just making some of those connections to those progressions, those mathematical progressions.
Yeah, I would emphasize here that, just like I said earlier, they don't make, one of the reasons that kids struggle with math is they don't make the connections you think they should make. For example, you think if they're making sums to 10 with 10 frames, it should be no problem for them to do it with numerals, and it's a new thing. In fact, you might even try having the 10 pair and numeral match to 10. So the number 4 and a 6 and a 10 frame that go together. Okay, place value games. Many of these do not seem like games. Let me talk about no chutes and ladders. I forgot, Carly, to ask you to bring our friend's game. I buy blank game boards. They fold open, right? And kids make a 0 to 100 board on there. There's a lot of issue, especially with kids at second grade who are having trouble about understanding how the number system works and how it turns over. And so you have them build this game and play it with dice. One of the most famous research studies ever done on early number was an intervention study by Robert Sigler around chutes and ladders. And he found that playing chutes and ladders improves students' a sense of magnitude, and that improvement held true even into third grade. It was predictive, actually, of better third grade performance. So not chutes and ladders is just some kid-made version of that, but the important part is, I mean, it's good that they play the game, and we do play the game, but building the game is the more important part. A word of advice, probably unnecessary for you, but I'm reminding myself, you need permanent markers to do the game. If you don't have permanent markers, it's ugly. Okay, two other quick ones, and then I'm going to stop for some quick questions or conversation. The bank can't tell you why the kids think this is a game. But essentially, you give an equation, and by the way, I'm always going to advocate for you writing equations, addition or subtraction equations horizontally rather than vertically. I am not ambivalent about algorithms. I am anti-algorithm. At this level, the thing that keeps a kid from understanding how to subtract is the subtraction algorithm. If you don't teach the subtraction algorithm, you will have fewer kids that need math intervention for it. You can take that to the bank. So let's suppose you did a 129 plus 234. So there's a variety of trades that one kid has to ask the banker. One kid's the banker, one kid's the doer. Give me 100 and 2 tens and 9 ones. And so there's a pile, all right? And then give me and then we put them together and the kid does the trades. And the banker asks 2 questions, always. Is it a fair trade? So the kid has to take their 10, the first few times anyway, take their 10 ones and put it next to a 10 to prove that it's a fair trade. Or take their 10 tens and put them on top of 100 to prove that it's a fair trade. And then the second question the banker asks is, how many do you have now? And this is because, as many of you know, second graders think that after a trade, they've got more or less blocks. And so those 2 questions are asked. We do the same thing for a game called Grab and Trade, which is essentially a bucket of ones. A kid reaches in and grabs a handful and then makes trades to figure out how many cubes they got. In the age of COVID, you need to have separate buckets for separate kids. Just saying. All right, I am going to stop there. This presentation will be posted. If you have any questions about this now or comments, let's stick them in the chat and let's see what I can do. We have a couple of minutes anyway.
There were some ideas, if people haven't had a chance to look at the chat, there were a few ideas about making things COVID friendly. Just some things that people found to work. So I assume in the recording, those would also be still available. So for some of the longer ones.
Wait, Bryn, can you say more about what you mean with you driving?
Sure. I'm teaching second grade fully remote students right now. And so when I mean me driving, if we're in a live session with kids, like I have a game board up and I'm moving the child's marker along the game board. They're still talking and sharing their thinking, but it's been a little bit challenging with young learners to have them moving their own pieces or trying to interact with a Zoom screen plus another screen. So I kind of hold the game structure, but the kids are still doing the math and talking about their math thinking.
Cool. There's a question in here too about doing this remotely. So there's at the end, the last slide is a bunch of NCTM game links, which can be very productive. There's a 5 frame and a 10 frame. There's various counting ones. Um, what the difference between assigning them to the kids to mess with and intervention is your presence and asking the questions as they play. And honestly, it can be very, very productive. How did you know? You know that when the let's take a really simple one. One of the games on the 10 frame game is it puts circles into a 10 frame and says how many are missing. And so when they say 4, you say, "How did you know?" Well, I recognize that. Suggestions for students who are not very verbal. um, well, that's a much longer question, and actually, it's not going to be helpful to you now. I'll just, as point of information, is we did a research study on kids participating in number talks non-verbally. So we spend about 6 months developing a core board with icons on it, so that a student specifically designed to participating um, without speaking. So a kid can use an eye gaze, for example, to activate the icons on this board to be able to participate in a number talk. We haven't, it hasn't been field tested yet because we haven't got a grant to do that, but we're in the process of doing it. So the core board, which I can send you a copy of, it doesn't need to be electronic, is a way that helps kids pre-organize their thinking. And we're hoping that eventually it will be useful for kids who are not nonverbal but just need some cognitive organization before they share their strategies.
I have a kiddo in first grade who is extremely shy and he refuses to talk. And all of our interventions are remote right now. So I was having that problem, and a couple things that I've been successful with. I've had 2 successful sessions with him. He uses, we call it his math hands. He's in first grade, so going up to 10 right now is, and if he wants to go higher than that, I just say flash the 10 first, and then however many more you need, which actually is a lot of thinking for him to do. He also has a sheet protector with a piece of white paper in it and a marker at home, dry erase marker. And so it's a whiteboard. So we've been playing, I play this game called Race to 20, and I have a number line up to 20, and I roll a dice, and he has to say where it's going to go to so he can put the number on there. So that has a lot to do with like number recognition and all that stuff. But if he doesn't have it, if the kid didn't have it, it would be harder, but he has some skills already. But those are a couple things that I've done, like the whiteboard and thumbs up, thumbs down. But it is hard, but that's what I've used.
Yeah, the thumbs up, thumbs down can be really helpful because often you can give choices. Is it this or is it this? The problem with it is the how do you know or why becomes a lot harder proposition. The math hand things is wild because I have some kids who are less verbal and they'll look at a 5 roll on a die and I'll say how many and they'll do this. Really interesting, right? Without saying 5, they'll do this or they'll do this or they'll do this. I'm like, one of the things that I think makes this work is my wheels are always spinning about, okay, so what's going on inside their heads that they reach for those fingers first, and how can we connect that? When I'm working with kids with autism, that's all I spend my time doing is I see them thinking and I think, okay, what is going on in there? Like I need a speaker so I can hear those connections that they're making. I heard that maybe Middlebury, someplace, has a core board painted on the playground, which I thought was fabulous because kids could use it out there together, kids who were nonverbal and kids who were verbal. Okay, I hope that was helpful for you. Thanks so much for coming, and hopefully enjoy the rest of your All Learners Day.